Okay, it's just gone 4 o'clock, so we're going to get started to make sure we stay on time. Welcome to this session on the role of metrics in assessing research performance. I don't know how many of you were in the earlier session today on altmetrics, but it was a really good, lively session. And this is quite a good partner to that one. In fact, we initially thought we might combine those two sessions, but we decided there was too much to look at in terms of altmetrics is still in an early stage of development, but at the same time there is an awful lot happening in research assessment, and we probably need 2 sessions to look at that. So that's what we're going to explore today. I have 3 great speakers with me who I will introduce to you shortly. We're going to talk together for about an hour, and then we hope to have half an hour for questions. So do scribble some ideas down as we go along, and hopefully we can have a good discussion at the end of this session. So jumping in, measurement is the world in which we live in now, and there's an awful lot of developments happening in research assessment at the moment, and altmetrics are just a tiny part of a much bigger story in terms of how governments, funding agencies, institutions are starting to evaluate their output and the work that they fund. I started looking at this just to give myself an overview, and this is the beginnings of a table. I say the beginnings because after about half a day's work I ran out of time and energy and realized that what I was looking at was an incredibly complex landscape. The way I chose to dive in was to look at different countries' policies from the perspective of government, institutions themselves, private non-profit funding agencies and so on, and just get a kind of snapshot of how these different groups in these different countries were evaluating research. And this embryonic table just begins to show what a huge spread there is in terms of approach. I mean, if we look at Japan, there was very little assessment at all prior to 2008. If we look at China, we know the impact factor is something that a lot of publishers beginning to look at how to sort of move away from in terms of research assessment, but it's incredibly important in China and South America too, where scientists are paid huge amounts of money for publishing in high-impact journals. Peer review is still important in all sorts of countries, but increasingly it's the metrics side that's becoming more interesting, with things like star metrics by the NIH. And in the UK, we have a new research excellence framework in place, which is putting much more emphasis on impact of publications, and so how we measure impact is going to become very important. So that's just a snapshot, and what it shows is that assessment models are still very much evolving and changing, and there's a mixture of qualitative peer review that's still being used, but data analysis is becoming very important too. Star metrics, snowball metrics, which is an initiative led by Elsevier with 8 or 9 institutions in the UK. The Becker model, which looks at biomedical research impact within institutions, and Christy, to my left here, will be talking a bit more about that shortly. And also this idea of not just looking at academic impact, but also the broader impact, political, social, economic impact of the research that funders are supporting, and evaluation in both the short and long term. So these are the kind of goals of the funding agencies and the institutions who are paying for and buying our content. And obviously that rolls down to the individual researcher assessment too, because an institution's performance is the aggregate of its research base. And it's important for individual academics in terms of their career progression, and I think we'll see the rise of a much wider range of metrics around those things. And publications remain key, but there seems to be a move away from things like the impact factor towards more individual assessment of impact based on individual article citations, usage, an author's H-index score, and how altmetrics fits into that picture too will become more important as we move forward. I mentioned the impact factor earlier too. We have the DORA movement coming out of San Francisco and the American Society of Cell Biology saying the impact factor is an imperfect measure of research assessment. So we know that there are problems. we know that we now have access to a much wider range of data to give us a much richer picture of the impact of the research that's being funded and produced. So this landscape is likely to change significantly over the next few years. And the question I had in my mind, well, as publishers, as most of us are in this room, does that matter to us? Do we need to be interested in this? Should we allow that to dictate what we do and don't publish in terms of understanding what funders want to achieve with their money? I think as a marketeer, my heart says we need to understand the flow of money in the system and how we can support the research community in achieving the objectives they need to achieve in order to continue to be successful and attract that funding. So it is an area I think we need to get much more interested in than perhaps we have historically been. We also know that we're in a very competitive situation now in terms of, certainly in the UK and the US, investment in research is declining in real terms. It's not true of every country in the world, but certainly things are becoming a lot more competitive. And as they become more competitive, obviously the people funding all that research are going to need metrics to understand where their money is most effective. So I think this is going to become hugely important, and we're already seeing many changes underway. And I think we're also going to see, as a result of that, new organisations, new initiatives coming into the market to help improve impact too. I just give a quick plug for an example that I'm involved with here, an initiative called Kudos, which you can have a look at growkudos.com. So services like this that will say we've got all this data about performance, how do we now improve our performance so that we can attract more funding? And this is one of perhaps many, I think, services that are going to come into this space in the next few years. So I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today, Dr. William Gunn, who's Head of Academic Outreach at Mendeley, and Dr. Christy Holmes, who has a very long title here, Washington University Institute of Clinical and Translational Sciences Tracking and Evaluation Team, the Becker Library, and also is heavily involved with a project which you may or may not know of called Vivo, really interesting initiative which you'll be telling us a bit more about today. And Michael Habib from Elsevier, who's project manager working on Scopus. So together these speakers are going to give us a bit more information about what's happening in this much broader metric landscape. So first up is William.